from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and there is much to discuss today. By the way, just in case you're ever wondering, yes, I am going to have guests on. It's not just me talking. We kind of got this going last fall. We kind of got this re-going after what had happened a year ago, which was my STRAT co-host. It still kind of hits me and others hard every day, but passed away out of nowhere on Christmas morning. So anyway, with that said, we're going to move forward, and there is just a lot happening, not the least of which is that this week there's an inauguration back in Washington, D.C. President Trump is coming back for a second term. Rather unusual in U.S. history to have a president have a first term and then get voted out of office and then come back and get voted back in. That's a rather unusual situation. And so we are seeing a little bit of history. Regardless of your politics, it's a little bit of history here in terms of how this has happened. But of course, one of the big things this week is that the Israel and Hamas actually reached an agreement on a ceasefire, portending an end to the Israel-Hamas war, an end to the immense violence and kinetic operations in the Gaza Strip. So that's big. And I want to talk a little bit about that, what's going on. As of Sunday morning, January 19th, the first exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners had occurred. 3 young women, one of whom had dual British Israeli citizenship, were exchanged, went into Israel. The Israeli officials got them, took them off to a hospital, and in exchange for that, 90 Palestinian prisoners and what are called detainees have been released. And I shouldn't say a little something about the detainees. I should say something about the whole, that seems like a big ratio. I mean, you're looking at 90 Palestinians released for 3 Israelis. But one thing I would like to say about that is about 69, I think, of them were women and young people, youth. They think the youngest was 15. And some of them have been rolled up for doing things, at least reportedly rolled up for doing things like throwing rocks at Israeli police officers, soldiers, things like that. And so there's a number of those that are in that 90. And at some point, they're probably going to be released anyway. Now, with that, there are also some there are Palestinian prisoners who are hardcore terrorists, murderous thugs, if you will. And that is going down hard politically with the Israeli public, particularly with the far-right members, if you will, the more conservative members of Netanyahu's coalition government. So that's what's happening. Literally, that's what's happening this week. And there will be follow-on releases. There's a total of 33 Israeli prisoners are supposed to be released. I think the ratio starts to decrease a little bit over time. But one of the challenges that almost didn't happen, one of the things that Hamas had to do under this agreement was provide a list of hostages to be released to Israel. Now, sometime back, Israel had provided a list of hostages that they thought were alive, and with that list, they had a list, I think 33 of who they thought they would like to see on phase 1. And Hamas was supposed to come back after they had done their internal vetting, if you will, of whatever it is, to find out who they had, who they could release, and provide a list. As of last night, they still had not provided that list. And Israel did not slow down. Israel kept the pressure on. They actually did airstrikes in northern Gaza and central Gaza, inflicting casualties, and basically said, look, Hamas is not abiding by the agreement, which is true, they were not. And eventually, Hamas did come up with 33 names. They said it was a technical, administrative problem they were having getting those names out. But I think the reality was Hamas, and this has always been a challenge, doesn't have really good control or even good visibility on all the hostages that they have. So they were a little bit slow because I think they're trying to figure out can they get some of these hostages to the release point to turn over to the American or turn over to the International Red Cross. Then the International Red Cross takes them to the border, turns them over to the Israelis. So they were having some real technical problems, not just technical administrative, but some real problems in terms of what they can and can't do. So that's going. Also, one thing to consider is that every hostage released by Hamas is a significant diminishment of whatever leverage Hamas has. So that's a big problem they have. They know that. Obviously, the first three is not really a big deal. But once they start getting down to having certainly far fewer numbers of hostages remaining, they will have less and less leverage. And I'll talk more about that as that goes. Now, something I do want to mention is an interesting repatriation piece. As you may recall, earlier in the conflict, there was a ceasefire. It didn't last for that long. And of course, one of the problems was that Hamas was having difficulty at the very end providing live hostages. And that got into Hamas's ability to really know who they had and did they have really strong control over them. And that ceasefire broke down. Well, one of the things that came out of that was the hostages came back. There was a lot of publicity, a lot of cameras, all these big reunions with all the family flooding in to the hostages. And one of the things that came out of that was it was just overwhelming for the hostages. It wasn't adding injury to the injury they'd already suffered per se. But one of the things is the Israeli authorities, and particularly the psychologists, medical personnel, realize this needs to be a much more phased approach. They need to look at the physical well-being of the hostages, but also look at the emotional and psychological well-being of the hostages, and not to overwhelm them, not to provide too much, shall I say, stimulation, if you will, with too much family, too many friends hitting them all at once, too much public adoration or whatever, too much public recognition hitting them all at once. It was just simply overwhelming. So when they bring them back this time, they're doing it a very phased approach. They're having the mothers initially, just the mothers, greet them, give them big hugs, stuff like that. Then they take them in they do an initial medical screening. International Red Cross does screening. The Israeli authorities do screening. Then they take them off to a hospital, do a much more thorough physical assessment to find out where they are, what needs to be done to get them physically well, if you will. And then gradually they're going to bring in more family members to see them in a very controlled manner. And then they actually have something they've set up. They have these trailers that they've set up. It's in a warehouse. It's rather interesting. It almost looks like they're going out camping or something, except they're in a warehouse. But they have these RVs set up, very well appointed. They even have outside furniture where people can sit down, meet, talk. But it's to give them a sense of privacy that you would not get in a hospital environment. Someplace where they could close the door and just be themselves. And then also a place where they can kind of meet people in a more casual, open setting. And it's a way to kind of decompress before they're actually repatriated with their families. Full medical care is afforded right there. So if they have any issues, medically speaking, but it is a rather interesting way that this is being done. With that, Israel has been withdrawing gradually. It's not a major withdrawal from what I can tell, but it's a gradual withdrawal from key urban populated areas within the Gaza Strip. That's part of the agreement, that they're going to pull out of the populated areas and move back to the hinterlands, if you will. Although if you know anything about the Gaza Strip, there's not a whole lot of hinterland that they can move back into. It's a fairly densely populated area, but there are areas outside of the traditional urban landscape, if you will, that they can pull out of. Also, they're flowing in a lot of aid, about 600 trucks a day, which if you go back historically, that's actually more aid coming into Gaza now than before the October 7th attacks, 471 or 470 some days ago when this thing actually began. So that's a big increased flow of aid. That will be very welcome. All right. Now, one of the problems, and we saw this with the initial images coming out, you saw the three young women hostages being released, and there they were, Qassam Brigade Hamas fighters in uniform with masks, weapons, looking like pretty much like Qassam Brigade did on October 7th, if you will, when the attacks took place. And that was a deeply disturbing image to see. I don't know how many total Hamas fighters. There are reports that Hamas has regenerated, if you will, recruited enough fighters to replace what they had before. It doesn't mean the fighters they have now are as proficient or capable as what they had before, but in terms of sheer numbers, there are a number of Hamas fighters that are still there. So that's very disturbing. Also, with the aid going in, because there is no other governing entity to speak of, the aid's going to come in, and effectively, de facto, Hamas controls who gets aid. So this huge aid flow is actually going to, if you will, revalidate Hamas as a governing entity. And that does not sit well with the Israeli government or the Israeli public at all, because that's one of the going in objectives of October 7th was to remove Hamas from power, that they would not govern the Gaza Strip, and also that they would not pose a military or terrorist threat to Israel. President Biden, upon the release of the hostages, this first phase or this first 3 hostages being released, basically said, hey, look, phase 2, phase 3 are being negotiated, but that Hamas is not supposed to be governing in the Gaza Strip, nor are they to pose a military threat or terrorist threat to Israel. And so that's a big thing. Hamas certainly does not see it the same way. Hamas sees this as a pause in the kinetic action, a pause in military operations against them. This is an opportunity for them to reconstitute, regain control. And frankly, when the ceasefire was announced, they immediately jumped up and started claiming that they had achieved victory, that they had been successful. Despite all the devastation, despite the destruction, the loss of life, everything, in a very Hamas sort of way, they were rolling out their proverbial mission accomplished banner and saying that they'd been successful. And that does not go over well. That is a rhetorical challenge that goes right to the heart of this issue. And that's one of those issues that Israel just cannot allow to happen. They cannot allow Hamas to take over. Politically, it's not just Netanyahu's coalition. This causes problems across the Israeli government, across Israeli society, if Hamas remains in place. Now, that's what's going on with the aid, and that's a bit of a challenge right now in this phase 1 of this, as they're releasing the hostages, which is not surprising, because they control the hostages, so to speak. But the other problem is they're divvying out aid. In some ways, that may be the bigger problem, is the fact that they now control the aid that goes in there, which gives them control of literally life support, if you will, for the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Phase 2 negotiations are supposed to start on day 16 of phase 1. That's where they will negotiate the full withdrawal of Israeli forces. Of course, the big issue there is going to be the Philadelphia corridor. That is that border area, if you will, between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, an area that was permeated with smuggling tunnels, an area where not just food and other things, but weapons, missiles, as one Israeli government spokesman was saying yesterday. Basically, the fear is that, right now, militarily, they've stopped, they've degraded the missile and anti-tank missile and everything else capability that Hamas has. The moment they pull out of that Philadelphia corridor, Hamas is in a position to reconstitute those lost weapons by smuggling from Egypt. Even if Egypt says, oh, no, we won't let it happen, there's nothing physically on the ground that really will stop them from that happening. So that's a big problem. Now, phase 1, just for reference, is 42 days long. The question is, will they be able to go to a phase 2? That gets into the problems that Netanyahu has with his coalition. I'll talk about in a little bit, but also who will come in and provide security. And that's going to be a really, really big problem that they've got to work through, because one of the discussions was that Arab states might provide forces, security forces that could come into Gaza to provide security on the ground. That's going to be a challenge. And Hamas, I really don't see Hamas disappearing. I don't see Hamas, willingly get up and leave. That's one of the things that Israel has put out there as an option. is that Hamas could actually, kind of like what they did with Beirut, if you want to go back to the early 80s with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, where they literally put them on ships and took them over to Tunisia. They have talked about doing the same. I've even heard Sudan, which is interesting because Sudan is in the middle of a very violent, horrific civil war going on right now. But they've talked about sending them to Sudan. So that's an option. Where do they go? And that's going to be a big challenge for the security forces, because if they were to go to Sudan, that gets into the dynamics of Sudan, which is who supports what. And that really gets kind of quirky. And I don't want to rework Sudan issues, but let's just say that some of our allies in the Gulf, we're in odds as to which side of that civil war that they support, and it's very strange. So how can Israel stop Hamas from reconstituting? If they can identify all the Hamas operatives, all the fighters, and they send them away, then they got to, these Hamas fighters are most of them are from the Gaza Strip, so that's where their family's from. So they got to stop them from coming back and infiltrating back into the Gaza Strip area and becoming a force, if they could do that. Of course, part of the problem is, can they identify all the fighters? I don't know if that's even truly possible, not 100%, certainly possible. And then, trusting Hamas to actually have its personnel leave, the trust and confidence in Hamas, and Hamas has already shown that they're not really to be trusted in any of this. That just seems to be something of a lofty goal if they can get them out. So that's going to be a big problem, is how do they stop them from reconstituting? And as I mentioned, in terms of sheer recruiting, they have recruited enough, at least reportedly have recruited enough people to replace all those who have been killed in this entire war. So they have personnel on the ground, and that's going to be a big issue going forward. All right. Another issue is Hamas immediately celebrating the ceasefire as a victory. That is to validate them as being in charge, validate what they did on October 7th, validate all the suffering that the Palestinian people of the Gaza Strip have undergone, validate the loss of life of all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, to say, look, we won, we were here, we achieved victory, which certainly by any reasonable metric, they've been decimated. They've been wiped out. Their leadership has been destroyed for the most part. And it's a ridiculous assertion, but nonetheless, they are asserting it. They were asserting it in the West Bank. They were asserting it in the Gaza Strip. And that really, it's a gut punch to Israel, which is, okay, Israel's done all of this, taken all this pressure from the international community, everything else, has agreed to phase one, and then you got Hamas out there claiming that they won. And that is very difficult, certainly for Netanyahu to sell to his coalition when they see Hamas and other Palestinians out there cheering in the streets as to what's going on. And I think that's part of why Israel did not hesitate when Hamas didn't provide that list, from continuing with military operations to continue with that maximum pressure, to make it very clear to them that just was not going to fly, and basically to slow that down. Now, what will governance in Gaza look like? What will be the proverbial end state, if you will? That is unclear. There has been discussion of a kind of a technocratic Palestinian government. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion up front that the Palestinian Authority might come back in. Palestinian Authority still to this day is not popular, really not popular within the Gaza Strip, permeated with corruption, incompetence. And so that's a real problem with trying to get the Palestinian Authority in there. But there is no other technocratic Palestinian governing thing that you can kind of look at that could come in. And I don't know that there's something that could be put in place, certainly within, 12 weeks, which is what it would take to go to phase three. Phase 1, 6 weeks, phase 2 is 6 weeks, phase 3 is another 6 weeks. It would take a lot to put something in place to make that happen. So that's going to be a big challenge. And that's not one that Israel and Hamas are going to deal with alone, because if there are other Arab states that provide security forces, they're going to have a big, big say in what the governing authority is that those security forces will be interfacing with. And so it's going to be a big issue. All right. Also, keep in mind, as all this is in the backdrop, the Assad government in Syria fell. Assad and his family are hiding in Moscow right now. And essentially HTS, which literally comes from, led by who used to be the head of the al-Nusra Front, which used to be Al-Qaeda, is basically running Syria, or running, a big chunk of Syria right now. But I will tell you, with everything else going on in Syria, it is to be determined if that thing's going to blow up into another full-blown civil war. And that's very possible that could happen. But that takes Assad certainly out of the, takes the Syrians, I should say, out of the mix. There'll be no flow of weapons or support via Syria into southern Lebanon, and certainly nothing from southern Lebanon and Hezbollah going down to the Gaza Strip in any way, shape, or form. And Hezbollah is still trying to maintain its ceasefire, completely separate and apart from what happens, or what's been happening in the Gaza Strip and what's been happening with Hamas. So they're going to be working on that. And so those two major Iranian proxies, if you will, are not in play in supporting Hamas. And Hamas knows that. It's been a status quo issue for some time, for many weeks. And that's a big challenge that Hamas has. They know there really is no great end state for Hamas, and that's their big challenge. For Iran, they've got to be extremely worried, because Donald Trump, and I'll get more on that, is coming back in office. Very strong anti-Iranian rhetoric. Looks like he's going to ramp up the sanctions regime, if you will, against Iran. So they're very nervous, and they're going to be very limited in what they could do. Now, Netanyahu's got problems. Ben-Gvir is head of essentially police forces, his minister, multiple ministers within the cabinet. But Ben-Gvir, who is essentially the head of police forces in Israel, resigned outright with that. His far-right coalition partner or party has stepped aside. The finance minister, Smotrich, has basically is staying in this coalition. But he was basically saying, look, phase 2 is completely unacceptable, and if phase 2 happens, he's going to walk away from it as well, and he'll pull out. If he pulls out, essentially there is no coalition with enough members that they keep Netanyahu in power. One of his opposition party says, don't worry, we got your back, we'll keep you in power. But that's really only going to stay in place probably until this phase 2 and 3 is done. And I'm not even sure if certainly emotionally or psychologically that Netanyahu himself is really dedicated to what it would take to do a phase 2 or 3, particularly without any way of removing Hamas from the equation. And I don't see a way that that's going to happen. It's just, I've heard multiple, we're all looking at the same way, which is how do you get Hamas out of being a governing entity in Gaza? How do you get them out from being a military or terrorist threat to Israel by the end of this thing? It's just, that is not clear at all what's going on. So that's going to be a big challenge is for Netanyahu. And historically, he has looked, when these things have come up, he looks to his ability to stay in power first and foremost. And I do not doubt he'll do the same thing again. But I will say this, Donald Trump played a big role in this whole thing. He played an instrumental role putting pressure. He made it very clear in terms of putting the ceasefire into effect that, in so many words, there is no daylight between the Biden administration position and the incoming Trump administration position. In fact, he went further by saying if they don't have a ceasefire in place when he's inaugurated, there will be, quote, hell to pay. And I think behind the scenes, hell to pay has been very clearly communicated, not just to Hamas, but probably to the Iranians as well, as to what that will look like. Now, what will be the role of Donald Trump and his administration going forward? Well, I think he wants to put this aside because he wants to move to other things. He wants to focus on China. All right. He wants to focus on ending the Ukraine-Russian war. He wants to look at trade issues around the world. He's got issues in the Western Hemisphere, not the least of which, and I'll get more into this, with Greenland, Canada, Panama, and certainly a lot with Mexico. So let's kind of get into that. What is going on with this incoming Trump administration? Well, first off, a lot of focus on immigration and border security. I would expect that there is going to be a very complete wall in place along the southwest border. Certainly sometime within the first this term, if you will, of the Trump administration. I imagine there'll be a full court press on that. There's already reports of a mass immigration sweep, finding illegal immigrants and doing some mass deportations, either back to their home countries or to third countries that will accept them. And the first group will probably be criminal, illegal. I'm going to use that term. I know some say it's not a nice term, but illegal, undocumented, whatever you want to say, aliens who are not here with a proper visa, who have not gone through the system, that those who have committed crimes will be deported right away. Whether or not I think they're in jail or prison or whatever, they're going to try and deport them right away. They're also going to try and put back that stay in Mexico policy, which was to stop, basically illegal aliens or immigrants, undocumented immigrants, those who are trying to get asylum or whatever, to stop them from just rushing into the border, requesting asylum, and then being released into the U.S. That they can come in, they can request asylum, but they're still going to have to wait for the U.S. to work through the issues. That's something that I think President Trump is going to have. There'll probably be some very senior level discussions with President Sheinbaum of Mexico to try and figure out what this is. But the rhetoric's been pretty strong, and it's certainly any rhetoric where they talk about autonomous U.S. military action against drug cartels in Mexico, which would be pretty much a direct violation of Mexican sovereignty. That's causing immense political problems for the Mexican government. It's going to be a big issue. But then again, with President Trump, he tends to throw these things out there as markers, and then he can negotiate back from where this is. So that's been out there. That may be something that he negotiates back, and that gives some political coverage, if you will, for Sheinbaum to make some conciliatory things with the border issue that she otherwise wouldn't make, and being able to say, look, this is no longer on the table. It's going to be a big issue dealing with the drug cartels. I got to tell you, I think this administration, from everything I'm hearing, they are not messing around with the drug cartels. I say this as somebody who countered drug issues back in the 90s, worked with the high-intensity drug trafficking area program, and I think this is going to be probably one of the strongest anti-drug cartel administrations that we've seen in many, many, many years. With Maduro and Venezuela, I would imagine there's going to be a phenomenal pressure put on Maduro. I don't know if this will get the actual president-elect or our recognized president, who we recognize as the president-elect for the last elections, into place, but there will be phenomenal pressure put on Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela, among other things, poses a huge threat next door to Guyana. They claim historically that they own about 2/3 of Guyana. Of course, what they really want is they want to take over the exclusive economic zone offshore, because there is a massive oil and gas field that is being exploited offshore. The Guyanans may become the richest per capita population of any country in the world based on the size of that field. So that's something that they look at and they want. I don't know what's going to happen with Cuba, but I imagine there'll be a very strong position with Cuba. One of the things interesting, though, this just occurred, is Milei, the head, rather unusual head of Argentina, who won the election. Very strong, conservative, kind of sounds a little, he's sort of got some Trumpian aspects to him. Well, among other things, he's taken a country that has perennially had a huge budget deficit, and he's balanced the budget. In fact, I think they're going to have a slight surplus this year, and that's going to be big. That's something every country in Latin America is going to look at, is that he came in there with these very, shall we say, fiscally conservative ideas, put them into place, and now he's managed to stop the deficit. Argentina's got a lot of other problems. We'll see how successful he is with that, but that's absolutely fascinating that he was able to pull that off. Just to kind of round off things, I think that Ukraine and Russia is going to be a big issue for the incoming Trump administration. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg is the for the administration in dealing with this, and he's actually pretty hawkish. He's very much a supporter of Ukraine. With that said, overall, the administration is trying to find some middle ground to end the war itself, to end the bloodshed. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Now, Putin's got a big challenge, and I am one that thinks that this may go down the way, and Putin may decide that he's going to play hardball and try to avoid any conciliation. I'm just, you can almost predict this is going to happen. He's going to say, we declare victory, we keep everything we got, we do this, we do that, and I just don't see that as being acceptable. And it may actually turn out that we impose some stuff. We may, I don't know if we're going to send aid per se, but we may agree to some things to strengthen Ukraine's hand in this. And part of it's a recognition that Putin is in a really bad situation. One of the interesting things that's come out, those 12,000 North Korean troops, they're losing so many. They've lost, in terms of dead and wounded, over a third so far are out. And it said if they keep going at this rate of attrition, that all 12,000 of them will be either dead or wounded by April. And that is a phenomenal statistic. Now, North Korea could send more troops, but that is still a phenomenal statistic in terms of what they're losing. Right now, Ukraine actually has a tank advantage on the ground. The Russian tank attrition is such that Ukraine actually is better situated with not just more tanks, but better tanks on the ground. They actually, within that theater, if you will, within that war, they have a troop advantage right now. The Russians can't generate enough troops to overcome what the Ukrainians have. And if the Ukrainians can figure out their manpower and conscription issues, maybe they could do much better. 100-year agreement signed between Ukraine and Britain. I'm wondering if Britain is getting back into the military support business in a more significant way. They have got phenomenal problems within Britain's defense establishment to reconstitute and to regenerate what they've done. They've lost so much in recent years. So that's going to be interesting. And it'll be interesting to see what our reaction is. Looking at European NATO issues, the Baltic, Mediterranean, this hybrid warfare issue, the concern certainly expressed by the Baltic states and Finland, amongst others, Russia trying to mobilize forces on its border. I'm not quite sure what Russia can mobilize on their border anymore. But one of the things fascinating is that Lithuania is increasing defense spending not to 2% of its gross domestic product, to 5 or 6% of its GDP. And we have also seen Poland, amongst other countries, well above that 2% threshold. And I think the Trump administration, or the incoming Trump administration, talked about 5% as a goal of GDP expenditures on defense for NATO countries. I do think that is being heard loud and clear in the Baltic states. I've been to the Baltic states. They're very serious about defense, very serious about the threat posed by Russia. So I think you're going to see in certain places that 5% thing will not be a lofty goal. It'll be something that they put in place. As mentioned, the U.S. is going to have some very interesting discussions with with Denmark over Greenland. I don't see us militarily invading Greenland. I think that's something that's being thrown out there. I don't see it happen. I don't see us militarily invading Panama to seize the Panama Canal, but I do see some very interesting negotiations taking place that the U.S. will have a bigger say and a bigger role in what we do in these different locations. All right. Canada, a lot of the stuff behind the scenes is getting a better deal, if you will, in terms of trade negotiations, trade status with Canada. But I also think the other thing is Canada, particularly Trudeau, has been a complete laggard in terms of defense spending. Well, here they are. They got the Arctic has become a major issue. That's why we're really so interested in Greenland, if you will. The Arctic has become an area of global contention. Russia wants to control the Arctic if they get a chance. China wants to play a big role in the Arctic, even though they're technically not a bordering state with the Arctic. They still see a big goal of being a presence in the Arctic. And from our standpoint, we got Alaska, we got Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and then you got the Scandinavian states, which are all NATO now. But the big concern, I think, is that Canada has been underinvesting in its military for so long. And I think some of this is putting pressure, this whole thing about the 50 calling Trudeau a governor and stuff. I think it's a little bit of that famous Trumpian flourish, if you will, to basically to make it very clear to Canada, which is you need to step up your game. And a big part of that stepping up your game is you need to step it up militarily. And you need to build up your army. You need to build up your navy. You need to build up your air force. You need to build up your military contribution to NATO. And I think that's just under the surface. Z is not coming to Trump's inauguration. He was invited, but his vice president is. That's kind of unusual. There might become some sort of opening for a dialogue with China, even though there's certainly a lot of, it's going to be a very tough issue with China. Talk of 60% tariffs on Chinese goods coming in. So let's just say there's a lot of work to be done there. And then there's other things with the Trump administration nominees getting in there. I think Tulsi Gabbard's going to have a very interesting hearings as the nominee for Director of National Intelligence. There's still apparently a number of senators have a lot of questions over things that she has said in the past certainly about Russia, about Syria, but also some other things. And they're going to be clarifying how that goes. And there's going to be a bunch of executive orders. I think 100 or so are getting signed the first day. But one thing I will say, and this is something to watch, is what's happening with California. The LA fires has shown a real problem with how California does emergency preparedness, emergency operations, but also what have they done with that phenomenal amount of FEMA and DHS funding over years and years and years, that some of these fundamental, indications and warning program things were not in place. There are huge questions. Why was the response to the initial fire in Palisades so slow? Why wasn't there more preparedness for the issue there? Why wasn't there a big air component standing by when they knew that this wind event, and look, this whole thing about, the high winds, you can't drop. Yeah, there's a certain amount of truth. When the high winds are in effect at a certain velocity, yes, that's all true. But initially when the fire broke out, it looks to me like they had several hours of window where they could have gone in there if they'd had all the air support standing by to douse those fires and to make a big dent and to reduce the threat that those fires could have posed. Now, I'm not, this is something that's going to come out in the after action or whatever, but let's just say that there was a lot of things that weren't done, not the least of which is the LA mayor should have had the sense to know that when you see a potential disaster like this happening, you gracefully bow out of leaving town and going to Africa or any other foreign country for whatever purpose. You need to be in LA. You're the mayor of Los Angeles, and so she's taking a lot of righteous hits. Of course, her vice mayor that oversaw LA fire is actually under federal indictment, is my understanding, for corruption charges. So there's going to be a lot that comes out on this, but it's not just the city of Los Angeles. The state holds a phenomenal amount of responsibility in this, and clearly the state failed on many levels in terms of what's being done. And one of the things being noted to me over and over again is that the state's lead agency on emergency operations, the California Office of Emergency Services, you hardly hear of them. If they're on the podium, they're standing in the back. And it's very interesting to see that dynamic, and it's making a lot of people scratch their heads like, what's going on with Cal OES? Why aren't they out front? And I can speculate, but that's for another following podcast. Anyway, I have talked a lot today. I've covered a number of different things, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And yes, I will have guests on in the future. In case you're wondering if it's just listening to Hal forever and ever, that will change. But thank you for listening today, and hope you subscribe and you're staying tuned in for these as we go into 2025.